looked around your corporate office, or maybe watched the news, or just scrolled through your company's latest internal HR memo and felt like, well, like the institutions built by men have been completely hijacked.
Right.
Like objective merit, hard work, actual competence, they've all been systematically replaced by a system that, rewards emotional fragility and manufactured victimhood.
Yeah, that's a feeling a lot of guys have right now.
Exactly. And if you are nodding your head right now, if you're tired of the endless apologies, the mandated empathy seminars, and just that feeling that you are constantly walking on eggshells in a world you've helped build, well, today's deep dive is designed exactly for you.
Absolutely.
We are looking at a manual that claims to explain the history of our institutions before they were captured by feminists and Marxists. And more importantly, it is structured as a tactical guide for taking those institutions back.
Yeah, so the text we're mapping out today is an ebook. It's called Grievance Capital, a red-pilled analysis of victimhood economics, and it's by Conrad Riker. And the core premise is it's absolutely fascinating from an economic and philosophical standpoint. I mean, the argument is that modern corporations and state institutions, they don't exist to produce tangible value anymore.
Right, they've shifted entirely.
Yeah, they've been completely re-engineered to extract what the author defines as grievance capital.
Now, before we go any further into the actual mechanics of this, we need to state our mission here very clearly.
There we.
Because, look, this book contains highly polarized, intensely politically charged material. It dives headfirst into aggressive debates about gender dynamics, cultural Marxism, corporate politics, the culture wars, all of it.
Oh yeah, it pulls no punches.
Right. So we have to be absolutely clear here. As your guides on this deep dive, we are not taking sides.
Right.
We are not endorsing the viewpoints in this text, nor are we condemning them. Our role today is strictly impartial. We're acting as neutral, objective reporters, mapping out the exact arguments, the definitions, and the underlying logic so that you, the listener, can fully understand the architecture of this specific manifesto.
Precisely. We just want to give you the blueprint of the argument, piece by piece. That way you can evaluate the claims and the structural logic for yourself.
Exactly.
We are looking strictly at the mechanics. How does the author believe this system was built? How does it function? And ultimately, how does he propose dismantling it?
And if you want to follow along with that blueprint, I need you to do 3 things for me right now. First, hit that like button. Second, subscribe to the channel so you never miss our breakdowns.
Always a good idea.
And third, open up a new tab right now and check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books, because the ebook we are reviewing today is something you are going to want to buy and study for yourself to truly grasp the depth of the material we are about to unpack.
It really is. It's definitely a text that demands a close, careful read, largely because of how it's structured.
Right, the structure is very specific.
Yeah, so to understand how these institutions were captured, the book insists that we first have to understand how the language itself was captured, which brings us to the foundational framework of the text. And that relies heavily on the trivium.
Right, the trivium. So for those who might be unfamiliar with classical education models, the trivium consists of grammar, logic, and rhetoric.
Exactly.
It's the old school foundation of Western education. But why does this specific book structure its entire argument around this ancient progression?
Well, because the core thesis is that you cannot win a war of ideas if your opponent completely controls the definitions of the words you are permitted to use.
Oh, that makes total sense.
Yeah. The argument traces how modern progressive movements essentially colonized institutions by first changing the dictionary.
Right.
They dismantled the true definitions of words, the grammar phase, and installed what the text describes as psychological malware into the nervous system of the enterprise.
Wow, psychological malware.
Yeah, because if you alter the grammar, you inherently alter the logic. And if you alter the logic, well, you control the rhetoric, which is how society communicates and makes its decisions.
So let's start with that grammar phase then. Specifically, the grammar of the word grievance itself. Because the book makes a very sharp distinction here between a classical complaint and a modern grievance.
It does. The linguistic analysis here is really the linchpin of the early chapters.
Okay, break that down for us.
So if you trace the word grievance back, it comes from the old French graver, which literally meant to physically burden or to afflict or to crush.
Okay.
And that actually descends from the Latin gravis, meaning heavy or weighty. So historically, a grievance was an objective, measurable weight that obstructed production or caused physical injury.
So we are talking about tangible reality here, like a broken axle on a cart, a seized harvest. Or, a fractured skull on a job site.
Exactly. It was a physical referent in the real world. But Riker argues that under the modern cultural Marxist framework, the definition has been entirely decoupled from physical reality.
Right. It's totally changed.
Yeah, it has transitioned into a psychological loop of resentment. And interestingly, the word resentment derives from the Latin resentire, which means to feel again.
Oh, wow. To feel again.
Right. So a modern grievance is no longer an objective physical injury. It's an emotional replay mechanism.
I see.
It is a subjective loop that demands the external world constantly validate an individual's internal perpetual state of offense.
And if you're listening to this and you've ever had to sit through a mandatory corporate conflict resolution meeting where someone's lived experience of a totally harmless email was treated like a severe workplace injury, this is exactly the shift we're talking about.
Absolutely.
Riker argues this linguistic shift completely destroys the logical foundation of the workplace. And there is a specific concept brought up here, the fallacy of four terms, which perfectly explains this corporate gaslighting.
Yes, the fallacy of four terms. This is a concept from classical Aristotelian logic.
Okay, take us back to Philosophy 101.
Right, so in a standard categorical syllogism, an argument must have exactly three terms to be valid. For example, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal.
Right. Men, mortal, Socrates. Three terms.
Exactly. The fallacy of four terms happens when a word is used in two entirely different senses within the same argument. You're essentially smuggling a fourth concept in under the disguise of a familiar word.
Okay, so how exactly does human resources use this fallacy to extract capital?
Well, the text asserts that the entire corporate industrial complex runs on the equivocation of the word harm.
Harm, okay.
Yeah. For centuries, harm in a professional or legal setting meant measurable physical damage or literal financial loss.
Right, like if you breached a contract.
Exactly. If you harmed my business, you breached a contract, stole funds, or physically damaged my property. But today, the definition of harm has been subtly expanded to include subjective emotional discomfort.
I see where this is going. So when a corporate activist says your words cause harm, they're using the new subjective emotional definition.
Yes.
But, and here is where the trap snaps shut, they are demanding the severe institutional punishment associated with the old physical definition.
Precisely. That's the equivocation.
They want a person fired, economically ruined, and exiled because of an emotional definition of harm, while pretending it carries the weight of a physical injury. It's an incredible linguistic bait and switch.
It is a masterful manipulation of the grammar. And the text applies this exact same logical breakdown to the concepts of equity and justice, arguing that they are not complementary ideas, but rather mathematical and logical contradictories.
Let's unpack that, because every major corporation right now has a DEI department.
Right.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Most people just assume equity is basically a synonym for justice.
Right, but the text strictly defines justice as the assignment of reward, according to objective merit.
Okay, you do the work, you get paid.
Exactly. You produce the value, you receive the compensation. Equity, on the other hand, is defined here as the forced allocation of assets based on demographic identity, regardless of input or competence.
So by that logic, you literally cannot have both in the same room.
Precisely. Every equity initiative is framed fundamentally as an assault on justice.
Wow.
Yeah. If you are forcing an outcome based on identity, you are, by definition, robbing the person who actually earned the position through merit. The argument is that equity is an engineered mutilation of reality to ensure the incapable are artificially elevated at the direct expense of the capable.
You know, it makes me think of an analogy. It's like playing a high-stakes game of chess.
Okay, I like that.
Chess is a game built on rigid, objective rules, where merit, foresight, and strategy dictate the winner. You know exactly how the knight moves, you know exactly how the rook moves.
Right.
But halfway through the match, your opponent decides that feeling sad about losing a pawn constitutes a legitimate injury. And therefore, under the new rules of equity, they get to take your queen as compensation.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to visualize it.
You are suddenly playing a game where the rules of reality are shifting beneath your feet, and the person controlling the shifting definitions holds all the power. So, my question is, how does this manual suggest men navigate a system where the grammar itself is rigged?
Well, the instruction is absolute, uncompromising refusal.
Just refuse to play.
Yeah, you cannot accept the opponent's definitions. If you accept their definition of harm or their definition of equity,
Yeah.
you have already lost the war before firing a single rhetorical shot.
Right.
The text instructs the rational male to relentlessly demand physical reference for any claims of harm.
So what does that look like in practice, day to day?
So if someone in a meeting claims a microaggression caused them trauma, you refuse the subjective framing. You demand the empirical metric.
Okay.
You ask to see the physical damage or the literal financial loss. You force them to attempt to quantify the unquantifiable.
You refuse to play the chess game where sadness equals a captured queen.
Exactly. The strategy is to mercilessly expose the equivocation of equity in every professional negotiation by forcing the conversation back to objective, measurable reality.
Reclaim the vocabulary. Never apologize for facts.
Exactly.
Okay, that wraps up the grammar phase of the framework. But once we understand how the language is captured, we have to look at how that captured language is actively weaponized to restructure power dynamics.
Right. Which brings us to logic.
Right. If grammar is the vocabulary, logic is how those words are put together to build a system of control. And this brings us to a really interesting concept in the text called ontological fragility.
Yeah, this is a crucial pillar of the overall thesis. So in classical philosophy, ontology is the study of being, of what actually exists.
Okay.
Riker argues that in the modern enterprise, emotional fragility is no longer viewed as a weakness or a liability. It has been transformed into a tactical weapon.
A tactical weapon.
Yeah, it is utilized by the incompetent to bypass merit and control the productive class.
So fragility is actually armor.
More than armor. I mean, it's an offensive capability. The worker who can convincingly perform the most profound emotional devastation in response to a standard workplace challenge actually acquires dictatorial power over the productive hierarchy.
Because of the grammar shift we talked about.
Exactly, because the new grammar of the corporation treats emotional distress as equivalent to physical violence. The most fragile person becomes the most highly protected asset.
You know, I know exactly what case study we need to look at to ground this in reality, but I want to make sure we don't just recount the history, because the audience listening to this likely already knows the lore.
Sure.
The text brings up the James Damore Google memo from 2017. Damore was the senior software engineer who wrote an internal memo citing peer-reviewed biological and psychological data to suggest that differences in interest, rather than systemic oppression, might explain the gender gap in tech.
Right, everyone remembers that.
We all know he was fired. But what is Riker's unique philosophical analysis of why he was fired?
Well, the text frames the Damore incident not primarily as a free speech issue, but as a catastrophic ontological category error on the part of the corporation.
A category error.
Yeah. Damore presented empirical data. The corporate nervous system reacted to that data as if it were a literal physical threat.
Right.
The response from Google was not a logical, point-by-point refutation of his biological claims. They didn't bring on better scientists to debate his scientists. They fired him because the presence of objective data caused emotional distress among the staff.
Okay, but wait. Damore was citing literal, peer-reviewed biology. The argument here is that the corporation viewed empirical biology as a weapon.
Yes, and that is the crux of the absurdity the author highlights. A man presented scientific facts, and the corporation officially deemed those facts violent.
That is insane.
The text poses a stark question. If a statistical memo about standard deviations in population interest is classified as literal violence, what word do we have left to describe a steel wrench crushing a human skull?
Yeah, the definitions are totally collapsed.
By flattening the distinction between data and physical assault, the corporation completely decoupled itself from objective reality.
And to enforce this anti-reality system across the entire workforce, the book details the architecture of what it calls the intersectional grievance matrix.
Oh yeah, this part is fascinating.
Basically, moral authority in a company is no longer based on who produces the most code, or who generates the most revenue, or who is the most logically sound. It's assigned based on a multiplication of marginalized identities.
Right.
The text jokingly refers to it as oppression Pokemon. You gotta catch them all to win the argument. The more victim categories you inhabit, the more your subjective feelings outweigh objective facts.
Yeah, the analysis goes even darker here, suggesting this isn't just an accidental byproduct of overzealous HR departments.
Really?
Yeah. The text argues that activists deliberately deploy the dark triad of personality traits to seize and maintain this power.
The dark triad being psychopathy, Machiavellianism, and narcissism. How exactly does Machiavellianism manifest in, say, an HR manager organizing a diversity seminar?
So, a Machiavellian individual manipulates others to achieve their own goals, completely devoid of conventional morality.
Right.
In this context, the HR activist feigns maximum weakness to achieve maximum structural control. They weaponize the empathy of the productive workers against them.
Yeah.
Is a highly narcissistic framework because it demands that the entire corporate apparatus constantly validate their specific identity and feelings above the actual mission of the company.
Yeah, they don't care about the company's output.
No, they lack genuine cognitive empathy for the productive engineer working 80-hour weeks, which is precisely the engine of their success. They can extract resources without guilt because the system rewards their victimhood.
The book calls this environment a soft totalitarianism. It points to well-known cultural flashpoints, like the Evergreen State College Day of Absence, where white individuals were essentially ordered to leave campus.
Yeah, or the leaked corporate diversity training.
Right. The ones featuring figures like Robin DiAngelo that tell employees to be less white. But there's a specific chilling phrase Riker uses to describe this modern control mechanism. He calls it a velvety strangled genocide.
Yeah, the metaphor is meant to highlight the insidious nature of the control. It's a lot harder to fight a hug than a fist.
Right.
If a totalitarian state sends a soldier with a gun to your door, the dynamic is clear. It is physical force. You know exactly what you're fighting.
Yeah, it's overt.
But how do you resist a mid-level bureaucrat who insists with a calm, patronizing smile that they're only forcing you into a mandatory inclusion seminar to heal you? How do you fight someone who is firing you for your own growth?
Let me push back on this premise for a second, because we need to pressure test the logic here.
Sure, go ahead.
Isn't there a genuine need for empathy in a high-functioning workplace? We hear constantly from organizational psychologists that psychological safety helps teams collaborate better. It helps them innovate, it allows them to take risks without fear of being crushed by a tyrannical boss. Doesn't completely stripping away empathy turn a company into a sociopathic meat grinder where everyone is just a cog in the machine?
That is the standard defense of the current system, and the text anticipates it. The author makes a very sharp distinction between true, objective empathy and what he calls corporate empathy.
Okay, how does he define the difference?
True empathy, or cognitive empathy, requires an understanding of objective reality in order to alleviate actual suffering or solve a tangible problem.
Give me an example.
If a worker is buried under an impossible deadline because of a supply chain failure, true empathy is diagnosing the supply chain issue and reallocating resources to help him. It solves the tangible problem.
Makes sense.
Modern corporate empathy, however, requires validating delusion and subsidizing failure. It demands that you pretend a poorly written piece of code is acceptable because the person who wrote it belongs to a protected class.
Oh, wow.
It is an empathy entirely devoid of compassion for the competent, because the competent person is the one who ultimately has to stay late and rewrite the bad code.
So prioritizing feelings over objective output is fundamentally anti-reality, and it actively punishes the people holding the company together.
Exactly.
Which leads to a brilliant inversion of a very famous progressive concept, the invisible knapsack.
Yes.
We've all heard the academic theory that straight white men carry an invisible backpack of unearned privileges that make their lives easier. How does the book flip this?
It completely reverses the polarity of the concept. The text argues that the productive male does indeed carry an invisible knapsack, but it is not filled with unearned privilege.
What's in it then?
It is filled with the crushing heavy burden of generating the actual literal value of civilization. He's the beast of burden.
Right.
He's the one generating the tax revenue, physically building the infrastructure, and creating the corporate profit that literally subsidizes the HR activists who are actively trying to destroy him.
The quote that stuck with me here is that the activist wants to liquidate the native asset of male competence to fund their own sterility.
That's a powerful line.
It really is. It describes an entirely parasitic relationship. And this extraction of male competence isn't just happening in the HR department at your corporate office. The argument expands outward.
Yeah, it gets much bigger.
If this system is extracting capital at the office level, it begs the question, how is this system sustained when these employees go home? Which brings us to the macroeconomic and legal level, enforced by the state itself.
We are moving from the micro to the macro. The text views the state not as a neutral arbiter of justice or a protector of rights, but as an inherently extractive apparatus designed to facilitate the transfer of grievance capital on a societal scale.
Right.
And the primary battlefield for this extraction is family court and taxation.
To ground this, Riker brings up the tragic comedy of Dave Foley, the actor most famous for News Radio and The Kids in the Hall.
Right.
Foley's situation is used as a masterclass in how the state annihilates objective reality to punish men. Foley's Hollywood income naturally declined as his career cooled off, which happens to almost every actor.
Yeah, that's just the nature of the business.
But a Canadian family court literally ignored his current actual earnings. They legally imputed his past peak income.
Let's walk through the actual legal mechanism of imputed income because it is vital to understanding the book's claim about objective reality.
Okay, lay it out.
Imputed income means the court decides what you should be earning or what you used to earn and taxes you or demands alimony based on that fictional number, regardless of what your bank account actually says.
That's wild.
They essentially pretended Foley was still making peak Hollywood star money and demanded alimony based on a phantom sum.
And when he inevitably couldn't pay money he literally did not have, what did the state do?
They seized his passport and threatened him with prison.
Unbelievable.
The text refers to this as extraction with a gavel. The state used the threat of literal physical violence incarceration to demand the production of wealth that did not exist, to be transferred to a party that was no longer contributing to the union.
This leads perfectly into the core concept of this section, the institutional husband. I want to spend some time here because this completely changes how you view taxes. What exactly is the institutional husband?
Well, historically, marriage was a reciprocal covenant,
Right.
an economic and social partnership.
Yeah.
The patriarchal model involved the man providing the external resources and physical protection, while the woman managed the internal household and child rearing. It was a symbiotic exchange.
Right, a division of labor.
But the text argues that over the last half century, the state has systematically supplanted the patriarchal provider. The state now functions as a surrogate patriarch.
A surrogate patriarch.
Yeah. It extracts massive amounts of taxes from men and redistributes those resources to women who claim absolute independence while simultaneously demanding total subsidy.
The book cites some heavy statistics here, pointing out that in places like the UK, men pay roughly 72% of the net income tax.
Right.
Let's break that down. Men produce the vast majority of the surplus capital in society, and the state acts as the middleman, taking that surplus by force and redirecting it to single-mother households, welfare programs, and bloated public sectors disproportionately staffed by women.
And the mechanism that allowed this massive societal shift to occur, according to the text, is the legal inception of no-fault divorce.
I found this part fascinating because it strips away all the emotional baggage of romance and analyzes marriage strictly as a legal contract.
Yes, the author looks at no-fault divorce purely through the lens of contract law. In his view, no-fault divorce is a legal absurdity.
How so?
It is a unilateral breach of contract where the performing party, the husband, who is generating the revenue, is financially liquidated to fund the breaching party, the wife who initiated the dissolution.
Well, let's use a different analogy to explain how crazy this legal architecture is. Imagine you sign a lease on an apartment with a roommate. You are business partners. 6 months in, your roommate just decides they don't want to live with you anymore. They break the lease, and they evict you from the apartment.
Right.
But the landlord, backed by men with guns, legally forces you to continue paying 100% of the rent for that apartment indefinitely, even though you aren't allowed to live there, and your former roommate gets to keep the apartment and move someone else in.
Yeah, that's a perfect analogy.
In any other area of human civilization, a contract like that would be considered unconscionable. It would be fraud. But in family law, it's just a Tuesday. How does the state possibly justify this logic?
The author explains this through a psychological mechanism he terms the animus projective helix.
Okay, we need an ELI 5 on that. What is the animus projective helix?
So in Jungian psychology, the animus is the unconscious masculine side of a woman.
Right.
The text argues that the feminist movement, having rejected the individual biological male as a provider, projects their internal need for a patriarchal provider onto the massive federal apparatus.
Oh.
And the state happily accepts this role because the state inherently thrives on resource extraction and control.
So the state replaces the father.
Exactly. It's like the state has set up a massive compulsory insurance policy where only one demographic man pays the premiums, but only the other demographic is legally allowed to file the claims.
Right.
The state creates the very deadbeat dads it demonizes. It forcibly removes the father from the home, taxes him into poverty to pay for the household he was expelled from, and then publicly punishes him when he inevitably collapses under the impossible mathematical weight of imputed income and child support.
While we are on the topic of economics and math, the book uses this macroeconomic section to absolutely obliterate one of the most widely cited statistics in modern politics: the gender wage gap.
Oh, definitely.
The idea that women make 77 cents for every dollar a man makes, we've all heard it. Politicians run on it. How does Riker's text dismantle it?
He classifies the wage gap statistic as a material fallacy of the aggregate.
Let's break that fallacy down with a concrete math example.
Sure. So a material fallacy of the aggregate occurs when you take a massive complex data set and average it out in a way that erases all the relevant variables, leading to a false conclusion.
Okay, give me a scenario.
Imagine taking 100 people. 50 of them work 60 hours a week in a dangerous coal mine. The other 50 work 30 hours a week in a climate-controlled office.
Right.
If you just take the total money earned by both groups and average it out, the office workers make significantly less. If you conclude from that average that the office workers are being oppressed, you are committing a fallacy of the aggregate. You are ignoring hours worked, danger, and occupational choice.
Right. And applying that to the real world, men are the ones doing the logging. They are the ones doing deep sea welding, commercial roofing in the blistering summer sun, and long-haul trucking.
Exactly.
The text argues the gap exists because men are willing to sacrifice their physical bodies, their time with their families, and ultimately die younger doing the brutal, dirty work that keeps civilization running.
The author asserts that the wage gap doesn't prove systemic bias against women. It proves that men are willing to sacrifice their lives to chop the wood, while the grievance class sits by the fire and complains that the wood is burning too quickly.
Which transitions us perfectly into the implications of all this. If the language is captured by HR and the surplus capital is being extracted by the state, what happens to the actual physical output of Western civilization?
Yeah, that's the big question.
What happens when objective reality finally pushes back against this subjective framework?
Reality does not negotiate with feelings. That is the mantra that echoes throughout the later chapters of the book.
Reality does not negotiate.
Yeah. The author warns that a system optimized purely for grievance extraction cannot, mathematically, generate objective market value. You can manipulate the grammar all you want, but eventually, gravity takes over.
To illustrate this, the text uses a terrifying, highly visible, real-world example: the catastrophic failures of the Boeing 737 AirX. We aren't just talking about abstract philosophy anymore, we're talking about literal planes falling out of the sky.
Yeah, it's a grim example.
How does the book connect the culture war to aerospace engineering?
It draws a direct causal mechanism between the ideology we've been discussing and the planes falling out of the sky. The claim is that Boeing, once the gold standard of American engineering, systematically prioritized demographic quotas and ESG scores, environmental, social, and governance metrics, over what the author calls aerodynamic perfection.
Walk us through the exact mechanism of how that happens on an engineering floor. How does an ESG initiative cause an MCS software failure?
Well, when a corporation adopts this grievance framework, they flatten the vertical hierarchy.
Okay.
Historically, a senior engineer earned their position through decades of rigorous, flawless output. Their word was law because their competence was proven. But under an ESG framework, hiring and promotion metrics shift. You bring in junior engineers or managers to hit a demographic quota.
And suddenly, the new grammar applies.
Exactly. When a junior employee, who was hired for diversity rather than raw mathematical excellence, submits a piece of software that lacks proper redundancies, like the single sensor failure point in the NCS system, the competent senior engineer is terrified to forcefully correct them.
Because if they do.
Because if they criticize the work of a diversity hire, HR will frame that objective technical criticism as emotional harm or a microaggression.
Right.
The objective flaw goes uncorrected because the culture punishes anyone who points it out. The technical competence degrades, the redundancies fail, and the literal planes fall out of the sky.
It goes back to the author's strict classical definition of economics. The word traces back to the ancient Greek oikonomia, meaning the law of the household.
Right.
It was fundamentally the science of physical survival, not a postmodern theory of feelings. The foundation of material reality is production. It is the violent, demanding transformation of raw, unforgiving nature into usable goods.
You apply logic and physical labor to reality. Grievance capitalism, by contrast, produces zero physical reality.
None at all.
Let's look at the outputs. A diversity officer does not forge steel. An inclusion consultant does not pour concrete, write the server code, or maintain the power grid.
Right.
They are, in the strict economic terminology of the text, pure parasites on the host. And the host is the competent, productive male.
The book introduces a concept here called the feminist extraction economy paradox, which I think is the ultimate contradiction of this entire cultural moment.
Either the fatal flaw in the architecture. The paradox is this. The grievance class demands the skyscraper, but they hate the steel.
Right.
They demand the frictionless convenience of the smartphone, but they despise the obsessive, borderline autistic male engineer who had to work 90-hour weeks to invent it.
Exactly.
They demand all the luxurious fruits of masculine logic, structure, and physical protection, while violently rejecting and punishing the roots of its discipline. They want to reap the harvest while actively burning the farmers at the stake.
But let me play devil's advocate here, because the listener's probably wondering the same thing. If this system is so mathematically entropic, if it produces zero objective value and actively destroys the competence required to keep planes in the air, why hasn't it completely collapsed yet? Why are these Fortune 500 companies still operating? Why is the grid still on? Why hasn't the economy completely zeroed out?
That is precisely the dark warning, the text issues. The author states that the battery is bleeding dry.
Bleeding dry.
Yeah. The only reason the current system hasn't collapsed into total chaos is because it is feasting on a massive accumulated surplus.
Ah, okay.
Western civilization built up a gigantic reservoir of technological innovation, infrastructure, and capital over centuries of male-driven, merit-based production. The current parasitic system is simply burning through that inherited surplus.
It's like an heir to a massive fortune who thinks he's a genius businessman because he hasn't gone broke yet, but in reality, he's just spending his grandfather's trust fund.
Exactly. But that surplus is finite. The text argues that when the fiat currency finally collapses under the weight of infinite social programs, or when the logistical servers crash because the rigorous engineers were replaced by equity facilitators, the reality of nature will reassert itself.
Right.
All the psychological safety in the world won't fill an empty stomach. The quote used is brutal. You cannot eat inclusion, and you cannot burn diversity to heat your home.
That is a stark, terrifying image. It's like an engine running on absolute fumes, but everyone in the car is arguing over the Spotify playlist instead of looking at the gas gauge.
That's exactly it.
So, having diagnosed this disease from the micro level of HR grammar to the macro level of state extraction and impending economic collapse, the text finally provides the rhetoric.
Right, the final piece of the trivium.
This is the tactical word map. This is how the reader is instructed to respond. How do men holding the red pill fight back against a system that controls the language, the state, and the economy?
The final section is heavily focused on how to hold frame and reclaim the architecture of meritocracy. And the first, most absolute rule the author lays down is the deployment of what he calls the shield of unyielding contempt.
The shield of unyielding contempt.
Yeah, the rule is devastatingly simple, but incredibly hard for people to execute in real life. Never, under any circumstances, apologize to the mob.
He contrasts two very famous examples to prove this point, and I think it perfectly crystallizes the strategy. We talked about James Damore earlier.
Right.
Damore, despite his intelligence, tried to play by their rules. When the mob came for him, he apologized for his tone. He tried to rationally explain his scientific logic to people who were operating on emotional extraction, and he was absolutely devoured by the machine. He was exiled.
Right. And the text contrasts Damore with Joe Rogan.
Ah, Joe Rogan.
Yeah, Rogan has faced a dozen cycles of coordinated attempted cancellation. But Rogan operates on the ancient primal principle that the wolf does not apologize to the sheep for having teeth.
Yeah.
When the mob demanded an apology, he mocked them. He refused to kneel. He refused the premise of their grammar. One man apologized, was fired, and was exiled. The other refused to apologize and sits atop a 9-figure media empire.
The book states that an apology is never actually about making amends. An apology is an economic transfer of psychological and material capital from the producer to the parasite.
That is the mechanical breakdown of an apology in grievance culture. It is a confession of moral sin against the subjective feelings of the collective.
Right.
Where you apologize, you validate their premise that you are guilty, and you legitimize their right to extract capital from you, whether that is your job, your reputation, or your actual money.
The book also points to the infamous 2019 Gillette ad. Again, the audience knows the ad. The one where the razor company lectured men about toxic masculinity.
Oh yeah, everyone remembers that one.
Well, let's look at the specific market signaling involved here. Why would a megacorporation literally berate its own primary consumer base?
Well, the text argues that the Gillette ad was a masterclass in corporate misandry. But more importantly, it was a signal of profound institutional weakness.
Institutional weakness.
Yeah, the corporation believed that ESG compliance and appeasing the internal HR activists was more vital to its survival than actually selling razors to men.
Oh.
The author argues that when a corporation or an individual man bows to the grievance mob in that manner, it is broadcasting a pheromone of weakness. It invites further extraction. You essentially become the beta buck provider for an ideology that fundamentally hates your existence.
So, if you can't reason with them, and you must never apologize to them, what is the actual strategic move for the individual listener?
The text advocates for something called secession and the hidden empire.
Okay, what does that mean?
It tells men to withdraw their competence from the rotting corporate corpse. Stop trying to fix the HR department. Stop trying to vote your way out of the institutional husband's tax extraction.
Yes, the advice is tactical withdrawal. The author advises men to utilize the tools of the modern decentralized age to bypass the system entirely. Form anonymous LLCs to shield your assets.
Right.
Utilize cryptocurrency and decentralized finance platforms to escape the surveillance and taxation of the extractive state.
And socially, he advocates for building what he calls invisible boys clubs.
Invisible Boys Club, so purely merit-based networks.
Exactly. These are networks based purely on absolute competence, trust, and mutual defense. The idea is to starve the beast of its hypergamous tax revenue by quietly moving the actual production of value off the grid of the grievance matrix.
You just opt out.
Yeah, you trade value for value with other competent men, completely ignoring the mandated DEI structures.
Okay, listening to this and tracking the logic, it sounds a whole lot like going Galt from Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. You know the concept, taking your ball, taking your intellect, and going home to hide in a valley in the mountains while the looters starve to death in the cities.
Right.
Is the author just advocating for men to run away and hide in the woods?
It is a very fair comparison, but the text clarifies that this is not a retreat. It is not running away. The author frames it as the restoration of the vertical.
The restoration of the vertical.
Yeah. The current system is relentlessly horizontal, an egalitarian puddle of shared misery where everyone is forced to drown together in the name of equity. By withdrawing their surplus labor, men are simply letting that horizontal puddle dry up.
Ah, I see.
They aren't hiding. They are systematically climbing the mountain of objective truth. They are building impregnable financial and social fortresses of logic and preparing to rebuild civilization from the ashes once the parasite inevitably starves itself to death.
He wants you to survey the wreckage for reusable materials, not demand a support group. If they want to fly planes based on feelings, let them, but don't buy a ticket and certainly don't engineer the landing gear for them.
Exactly.
So let's bring all of this together. We have gone on an intense, massive journey through the architecture of Grievance Capital.
It's a lot to take in.
It really is. We started with a trivium, mapping the shifting grammar of HR policies and exposing how subjective emotional feelings were mutated into objective harm.
Right.
We explored the soft totalitarianism of the glass ego and the weaponization of fragility. We tracked the macro-level state-sponsored extraction through family court, imputed income, and the institutional husband.
Yeah.
We looked at the terrifying physical consequences of replacing merit with demographic quotas. And finally, we arrived at the practical mandate to utilize the shield of unyielding contempt, withdraw surplus capital, and build new, unapologetically competent structures.
It is a meticulously constructed argument. It uses classical philosophical frameworks, rigorous logical syllogisms, and hard economic data to completely deconstruct the modern progressive institutional norms. It shows the exact causal chain from a changed definition in the dictionary to a collapsed economy.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought experiment from the text that we haven't touched on yet. It's a concept the author calls the eschaton unborn.
Oh, this is a profound concept.
We hear constantly from the woke left that future generations will judge us. They say history will judge us for our carbon footprint, or our lack of intersectional inclusivity, or our failure to dismantle historical privileges.
But the text flips that entire moral premise on its head.
Exactly. Build on the logic we just discussed. What if the unborn will actually judge us on whether we kept the lights on?
Right.
What if they judge us on whether we maintained the power grid, kept the planes in the sky, and kept the barbarians outside the gates? If the producers, the men holding the frame of objective reality, truly withdraw their labor into a decentralized hidden empire, how quickly would the traditional state realize it cannot engineer a society entirely out of feelings?
Very quickly.
Your weakness, the text argues, your apologies, and your emotional fragility actively endanger the future of civilization. Only absolute competence secures it.
The future requires warriors and builders, not HR specialists and professional victims. That is the stark, uncompromising reality the book leaves the reader with.
It is an intense, unapologetic vision. And remember, if you found this breakdown of the book's architecture fascinating and you want to dive into the exact syllogisms, the legal precedents, and the tactical logic to reclaim your own institutions and protect your own capital, go check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to buy Grievance Capital, a red-pilled analysis of victimhood economics.
You can also follow the author directly to stay updated on his ongoing writing and analysis. Make sure to find him at Conrad Riker on Substack.
And of course, if this breakdown brought you value, please remember to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the books and ideas shaping the underlying mechanics of our world. We've given you the map of the territory. Now it's up to you how you navigate it. Until next time.